I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. To celebrate the new year, here is an episode about a windfall of money. In a historic and unprecedented turn, the state of Maryland is expecting to collect $2 billion in extra revenue. This is not the consequence of direct federal largesse, infrastructure spending, any of that, but largely comes from income taxes and corporate taxes. It is most definitely an indirect outcome of federal monetary and fiscal policy, which has put unimaginable amounts of money into the economy. Eric Luedtke, the Democratic Majority Leader in the State House of Delegates, and Roy Meyers, UMBC's budgeting expert, break down the politics of plenty.
All that you've done, girl. I kept the home you neglected, baby, while you was out having fun.
If you are new to the show, I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. It is my hope that this podcast will help those who feel left out reconnect in our local communities.
They just didn't know. And as our children grew older, well, honey, so did my pain. Well, so did my pain. Baby, it's good.
Music for this episode comes from DC area Southern soul band King Soul. Tom Clifford and Jake Flack on vocals, Mark Noon on bass, Arif Durrani on keyboards, Ben Holmes on drums, Chris Watling on sax, Matt Ripito on tenor sax, and Vince McCool on the trumpet. Don't miss them on New Year's Eve at Clyde's in Chevy Chase. In this week's news roundup, first, friend of the show, man about Rockville, James Hedrick on Montgomery County's new resident survey.
On December 27th, Montgomery County launched the 2021 Biennial Online Resident Survey. The survey is available to fill out online on the county's website and was randomly mailed to 5,000 county residents. Montgomery County ought to apologize to those residents. This questionnaire, because it does not actually deserve the name of survey, is a masterclass in bad survey design. First, it is way too long. It is a just bloated grab bag of topics and questions that don't have any coherence and kind of makes the DC movie universe look streamlined and well thought out. Worse, the survey tries to be sneaky. The instructions say that there are only 39 questions. Never mind that is already way too long for a survey. More than 20 of the questions ask you to rate multiple items. For example, approximately 3 weeks into the survey, question 10, which is please rate the quality of each of the following services in Montgomery County, respondents were asked to rate 43 different services on a 5-point scale from excellent to don't know. There are 43 questions within one question of the survey. I think my favorite question on the survey has to be question 11, item 6, which is rate the following categories of Montgomery County government performance on And item number 6 is being honest. I rated it poor. So the issue is not so much that the survey is long, though it is by my count 204 questions long. It's that the length will affect the quality of the responses and the response rate. They will both suffer. The responses are basically going to be useless for providing any valid data about how Montgomery County residents feel about anything. That's over and above the non-random nature of online responses. Basically, no matter how many people respond to this online survey, it's not going to be a representative sample of the Montgomery County population, but it will be a skewed sample of the people willing to answer 204 Likert scale questions about local government. Those people, and I am one of them, are not normal. We are not representative of a county of 1.1 million people. Survey methodologists are familiar with the concept of satisficing. Basically, the longer the survey is, the less time people will spend on each question. Even for those suckers, and I mean dedicated residents, who finish all 204 questions, the modal answer is almost going to be the middle response, which in this case is fair. So if by the end folks actually finish, the response to everything will be fair. Also, the longer that the survey is, the less people are going to finish the thing. Way more people are going to answer question 1 than answer question 204. All right, people get bored in the middle of these things and they will stop. It's called roll-off in ballot studies. Interestingly, guess what information the survey asks at the end? That's right, all the demographic questions: age, gender, race, income. So, how representative are the responses that the county will get? Who knows? It's going to be really hard to tell because a lot of people won't have answered those questions. Apart from the length and the poor data quality, there are issues with this survey about how questions are asked and framed. For one, not everything needs to be a Likert scale. You don't have to ask somebody to rate everything on a 5-point scale. It's not necessary. And if you're rating something on a scale of 1 to 4, the question probably shouldn't have an or in it. This survey is just so unlikely to produce valid data that it is unlikely to be useful for anything except being cherry-picked by decision makers and reinforcing their existing preferences. That's it. Also, not to put too fine a point on it, look around. Approximately half of Montgomery County works for some federal statistical agency, citation needed. We have residents who are experts in this kind of thing. We have survey experts in this county, people that do this for a living and people that do this for the federal government. We really, really probably should have asked them for help.
Ouch. Also, friend of the show and disability activist Catherine Lucas McKay points out that the survey neglects accessibility, aging, LGBTQ, among other issues. If you want to see for yourself, the survey is available on the county government website, montgomerycountymd.gov. It is the end of the second pandemic year, and this year was different from the first because vaccines allowed businesses, schools, and workplaces to reopen, and they continue to blunt the severity of the Omicron variant. Most deaths and severe cases now come mainly from the ranks of the unvaccinated. While we got the pharmaceutical right, we didn't get public health right at all. The consequences of years of neglecting public health were initially compounded by political and administrative mismanagement, but even a change in the federal government has not brought consensus on basic public health issues like masking and schools. There's little doubt that we let our children down. On a year-end television show, CBS reporter Jan Crawford argued that the biggest underreported story of 2021 was the impact of lockdowns on our children. She pointed to higher suicide rates, mental health issues, and learning loss, but not the fact that over 800,000 Americans had died because of COVID. Many of them were parents of children, and the lockdowns Crawford was criticizing was intended to slow down the virus and the deaths. On Twitter, Crawford calls herself a sports mom, and few people have been more ardent advocates of reopening than parents of student athletes. The math you can learn later, but time on court or pitch is lost forever. Whether or not schools could have stayed open or reopened quickly was a matter of resources and innovative thinking. Private schools with resources opened early, many upgrading their ventilation systems, changing classroom use, and even their staffing. Public schools, in contrast, initially felt they had no resources to bring about change, And then when the money finally arrived, found that they did not have the flexibility to be innovative. Relatively safer outdoor learning, it seems, became and remains the exclusive preserve of private schools. By and large, public schools in Washington DMV area have been unable even to organize outdoor lunch. Lunch, the one time when students must unmask en masse. It's either too hot, too cold, not enough staff, kids will run away. So yes, we failed the kids. We failed them because we couldn't, as a society, come to an agreement on what changes we should make to work around the constraints of the pandemic. The lesson of the pandemic really is not that science is real. Of course it is. But that politics is the reality. And we ignore the politics at our own peril. Our leaders at the federal, state, and local levels repeatedly sidestepped public health decisions and prayed for a pharmaceutical miracle. And boy, did Big Pharma bail us out and paper over public health gaps one more time. The federal government has promised $7 billion to upgrade public health capacity in local jurisdictions, but it is hard to see how it plays out in these communities. In Montgomery County, which is better off than most jurisdictions because of its size, wealth, and educated residents, the Department of Health and Human Services continues to struggle. It has not been able to expand its epidemiology staff throughout the pandemic. Its relationship with MCPS, a key partner, is chaotic with no governing document. In the fall, MCPS hired its own contact tracers after the health department let its own contact tracers go. MCPS is supposed to be testing its students and staff, yet no staff report being tested, and students are rarely tested even when their families have agreed to allow testing. And then once the test results are in, it is hard to track them down. There are state-sanctioned vendors involved, so the matter is even more complicated. And the state health department's COVID database was attacked and taken down, leaving the state and the counties unable to report Omicron numbers just before Christmas. The one positive story from the health department was that the Washington DMV area outperformed the country on vaccination. After falling behind on vaccinating minority populations, Montgomery County came from behind and bested the entire country in vaccinating minority communities, which had lost more than others to the pandemic. 2022 comes with a prayer as well. Please let COVID become a seasonal flu. Whatever happens, money is not going to be an excuse. Before we go to our big interview, today is the last day for 2021 tax-deductible giving. In past episodes, we included pitches from Passion for Learning, Community Farm Share, Everyday Canvassing, Youth Activism Project, Rockville Bike Hub, and Urban Adventure Squad. Today, we include a pitch from Miriam's Kitchen.
Hi, my name is May Powers, and I'm with Miriam's Kitchen. Miriam's Kitchen has been a trusted resource for individuals experiencing homelessness since 1983, providing over 1.2 million meals and helping over 1,240 individuals move into their first home in years. Today, Miriam's Kitchen serves as a lifeline for guests to access essential services that improve their health, increase their income, and help them attain a safe, permanent home. In the coming year, on top of its ongoing pandemic response efforts, Miriam's Kitchen will expand its street outreach team, grow its housing program, and push forward a more equitable system where every person has a safe place to live. You can support your neighbors experiencing homelessness and Miriam's Kitchen efforts by donating at miriamskitchen.org. All donations made by December 31st will be matched up to $150,000. Thank you so much.
I hope you will consider giving to these worthy nonprofit organizations. You are listening to I Hate Politics. I am Sunil Dasgupta, and I'll be back with Maryland State House Majority Leader Eric Luedtke and UMBC budget expert Roy Meyers.
Kinda
Eric Luedtke, Roy Meyers, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thanks for having us.
Good to be here.
Roy, if I can start with you, the Spending Affordability Committee came out with its recommendations. What are the highlights? What struck you?
Well, I think the continuing highlight has been the projections by the Department of Legislative Services, because it shows a remarkably large cash balance in the budget. And then also the projections for the out years, something that I don't think people have ever seen in the state of Maryland, which is very large surpluses. Whether those projections will actually come true is a difficult question to answer, but it provides the basis for some interesting decisions that need to be made in the next year and then beyond. And the Department of Legislative Services recommended some significant uses of that cash balance, which was endorsed by the Spending Affordability Committee. And those include putting more money into the rainy day fund to prepare for the next recession whenever it comes, because it's, in my opinion, unlikely the federal government will be as good next time as it has been this time in providing a safety net for state and local governments. And then putting some money into some of the underfunded activities of the government in previous years, such as deferred maintenance for the state's facilities. You know, one of the things that the state did in recent years is to, in effect, capture that money had been saved by state universities and other accounts to provide funding for covering short-term deficits. And the cost of that is pretty obvious. And now we need to catch up and put money back into repairing those facilities.
Eric, what do you like? And perhaps more importantly, what do you not like?
Well, there's not a whole lot not to like about this. It's an extraordinary situation for the state. We're in a really good fiscal position, and much better than at any time in my tenure in the legislature. It's been 10 years since I've been in the legislature, and I had never heard the word structural budget surplus before a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, there's a lot of positive here in it. And honestly, it just keeps getting better. The most recent numbers are actually a write-up from what we saw before. So, you know, we've got the money to spend to make some really smart fiscal policy decisions, like putting money away in our rainy day fund, our emergency savings account for future recessions, like catching up on some of these deferred maintenance projects, of which there are many. Like repaying something called the local income tax reserve account, which we borrowed from in previous fiscal years. So I think we're in a great position. The challenge is going to be that everybody and their mother is going to want to spend that money on something. And we have to make sure in particular that we're not spending money from a one-time surplus on long-term budget items or long-term changes to our revenue structure that will put us in a worse fiscal position when times return to a more normal situation.
Okay, let me ask you two specific questions. Are you going to get tax cut pressure as a consequence of this revenue windfall? And on the other hand, on the other side of the political spectrum, are you getting pressure on spending more, for example, on the coming eviction crisis or the mental health crisis in schools, right? Rather than putting money away and, you know, nearly doubling the rainy day fund?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be pressure on both sides. You know, on the spending side, you know, there is some money that needs to go into paying for our commitment to representation for counsel, right to counsel for people in eviction cases, for housing relief, for mental health. But honestly, one of the biggest spending issues after 7 years in the Hogan administration is an underinvestment in our state workforce. You talk to just about anybody in any state agency, and they will tell you they don't have enough people to do the job they're asked to do. They can't recruit or retain people because their pay is so low. And it's literally every agency. So I think that's going to be part of the conversation. Tax cuts will be part of the conversation, if only because, you know, Governor Hogan is very consistent in his message. When the times are good, he wants tax cuts. When the times are bad, he wants tax cuts. When the sun rises, he wants tax cuts. When it sets, he wants tax cuts. So, you know, I think that's going to be his demand in whatever budget negotiations occur.
Roy, can you explain the difference between a structural budget surplus and a regular budget surplus, or a structural deficit and a regular deficit?
It's a hard one for me to explain because the use of structural is different in the federal government, where I used to work at the congressional budget, and in the state. In practice, in the federal government, when we talk about the structural budget deficit, we're talking about the deficit that would occur when the economy was at full employment. In the state, the practice has not been to adjust for full employment versus less than full employment, but just to look at the longer term projections, in effect extrapolating from the current position out for 3 or 4 years. And as Delegate Luedtke said before, in all years before now, that's shown a structural deficit in the sense that revenues have been increasing slower than expenditures, and often they've been starting from a gap where revenues have been lower than expenditures. That is in a current year deficit. Now we're in the opposite position where revenues are extraordinarily high, in part because the state's revenues held up during this pandemic exercise. And in addition, that was because the federal government put a lot of money into the pockets of corporations and residents in the state. So they're doing quite well on average. Of course, there's a substantial portion of Marylanders, particularly those in the service sector, who are not.
Eric, you said that, a big part of the push is going to be on, expanding the state government and making sure that they have the right people there and all of that. The Spending Affordability Committee recommendation says 757 new state positions. But my question is, you want growth in a particular department or in a particular area, and the governor may want that growth to happen in another area. How do you ensure that?
Well, in the short term, it's a question of a negotiation between the legislature and the governor. And we do this pretty much every year. The governor, under our current constitutional structure, has the strongest budgetary authority of any governorship in America. But there are levers that the legislature has to put pressure on the governor for the things we want. So we have negotiations. And we don't get everything we want. They don't get everything they want. We come to a compromise. We've actually been, pretty efficient on that with the budget the last few years. That's all going to change soon, because the voters approved a constitutional amendment which will give the legislature more budgetary authority. So under the next governor, the legislature will have a stronger hand in those discussions. There's going to be a series of negotiations, a series of puts and takes between the two chambers of the legislature and the governor, and we'll end up with a product. It's hard to come up with a product that people will be unhappy with when you've got a budget surplus this big.
Sunil, could I add there? I think the governor should realize that what Delegate Luedtke said is quite obvious to many Maryland citizens. I mean, when you have the State Department of Health suffering from a cybersecurity attack and not being able to report the number of coronavirus cases right now, when you had the Department of Labor suffering from a very outdated information system that was incapable of dealing with the very large increase in unemployment insurance claims, there's plenty of evidence for Maryland citizens to see that we've underinvested in state government on the IT side. And as he said before, there have been very good studies done by the Legislative Services Department, particularly one by Dave Dupay in 2018, that showed that even back then, the state was very uncompetitive in the compensation it was offering, particularly to those people in professional level jobs. So the need to put money into rebuilding the capacity of Maryland agencies, I think, is pretty widely understood. And I would think it'd be unfortunate if the governor didn't recognize that in his budget request.
Well, I'm not sure the governor is not going to recognize that. My question was about, if he chose a particular department over another. So, for example, if he said, the police needs more money, and those are where the positions are going to go. Versus if, as you said, the IT problems that the health department's facing.
So what ends up happening in these situations is, the governor will propose a budget in January, and that's his recommended budget. Now, the legislature doesn't have to take that budget at face value. Our biggest budgetary authority under the Constitution is we can cut things. We can say, no, we don't want you to spend on this. But then we can't reinvest that money in other things necessarily. So what ends up happening is we have a negotiation with the governor. We reach some sort of agreement, and he will submit what's called a supplemental budget. And often the supplemental budgets will include spending items that have been agreed to through those negotiations. So, the governor will have his priorities. The legislature will have ours. But certainly state employment is going to be part of that conversation. I mean, just one example, I've been serving on the State Parks Investment Commission the last few months. We have the same number of park rangers as we did before the Great Recession, and we've got twice as many visitors in the state parks. So it's just the scale of what the rangers are dealing with is overwhelming. And you see that in a lot of agencies. And I think, as Roy said, there is a lot of recognition of that on both sides of the aisle, both chambers. I think people understand we've got to do something about this.
I do agree. And, but the part that is sort of, I think, not said here is also the pressure that you're going to get from the left, as Roy pointed out, that the services sector has not done well, during the pandemic, while others have, right? And so there is a greater need for immediate support, such as I mentioned, with eviction prevention or school mental health. And so how are you going to deal with that pressure?
Well, we'll be able to make investments in some of those priorities. On the housing, for example, we had some legislation that passed this past session. There's going to be follow-up legislation this coming session. We did, for example, make that commitment to a right to counsel for people in eviction cases, but we have to fund that. So that's definitely on the radar.
How much money is that?
There's different projections, but it's not, compared to the budget surplus, it's relatively small.
Right.
You're talking a few millions of dollars, right? When we have a multi-billion-dollar surplus. Some of those priorities will definitely get money. The sort of organizations who are actively engaging in conversations about the legislative agenda, with the exception of the public employees unions, who of course are focused on this issue of the public employee pay and staffing levels. A lot of them are looking at issues that aren't necessarily budgetary. For example, the debate over whether to implement paid family leave, how Maryland responds to the Supreme Court's, potential decision on reproductive rights. So, I think we'll be in fine position.
Okay. What about direct rental assistance?
So that is part of the conversation. I'm not sure how much addition. Part of the issue with direct rental assistance is there has been a lot of direct rental assistance made available that just hasn't been distributed to people, right? So I think part of the conversation there is going to be, do we appropriate more money, or do we make sure that the money that we've already appropriated or that the feds have already appropriated is actually getting to the people that need it, right? I think people are aware there are housing challenges, but also those housing challenges are long term, right? This isn't just a question of the pandemic. It's structural in our economy now. Housing prices are increasing much faster than the rest of the rate of inflation. They're increasing faster than wages are increasing. So, there's going to be a longer term policy challenge in making sure we have adequate housing for Marylanders.
Right. Any move towards a sort of investment in social housing or things like that?
There have been conversations in the look. 2-3 years ago, housing was not an issue that even popped up much in the legislature. It's now one of the top sort of 5-6 issues that get talked about. We have some legislators that have been pushing really interesting ideas, like Delegate Stewart, who's working on social housing legislation. So increasingly, I think I can't predict for you exactly what policies are going to pass, but it is absolutely on the legislative radar screen. And over the next few years, we're going to see it happen. And particularly, remember, we're going to have a new governor, right? And depending on the outcome of the governor's race, that could be a major part of a gubernatorial legislative agenda too.
Right. And so that was one of my questions to you both. And I'm going to jump several questions to ask that now, which is that how do you think the politics of surplus affects the governor's race? I mean, who's going to take that?
Well, I'll start. As Delegate Luedtke said, Governor Hogan has been consistent on tax cuts. And I think it's fair to say that that's the general brand of the Republican Party in this state. I think we should be somewhat thankful that they haven't moved to full Trumpism, as has been the case in a number of other states. And what we have likely coming up is the new version of tax cuts. It's not going to be a rain tax cut type of debate, but something else. And it'll be up to Governor Hogan to decide whether he wants to propose a broad-based tax cut or something that's more targeted. In his most recent budgets, he's had relatively small cuts targeted, for example, to retirees that were by and large rejected by the legislature. I would expect that he'd come up with something a little more broad-based in an attempt to help the, I think, likely Republican candidate for the governor's race.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, a couple more thoughts. On the Democratic side, the fact that we have this structural surplus means that how to fund Kerwin becomes a much less pressing question. When we passed it, expected it to be funded through 2025. Now we know it's funded through at least FY27. So, that becomes less of a debate in the Democratic primary. I think it's easier, frankly, for some of the Democratic candidates to make more promises than they otherwise would have. On the Republican side, I think really the part of the question is who's the nominee, right? If the nominee is more of a centrist, like Secretary Schultz, then I think the conversation stays largely focused on taxes because that's what Republicans were successful with Larry Hogan, right? If the nominee is Dan Cox, then I think the conversation in the general election shifts to social issues and Trumpism and becomes a very different race. So, we'll see.
Roy, what are the risks to the surplus in the out years?
What we do now is, in effect, assume that there won't be another recession over the projection horizon. And that's okay if you have enough money in the rainy day fund, and moving to 9% of general revenues might be enough. The Moody's did some stress testing of state budget rainy day fund sufficiency, and just prior to the pandemic, and it showed that we certainly hadn't saved enough, and we lucked out in that the federal government did step in. So if in fact we do have another recession, the federal government steps in again with very effective monetary policy and a very generous, perhaps even overly generous, discretionary fiscal policy for the state, we'd be okay. But I think that's quite unlikely. The other question about the structural surplus risks is the trend rate of growth for revenues and for expenditures. And it's always the case that budget estimates are going to be wrong to some extent. Sometimes they're underestimates, sometimes they're overestimates. Sure. So there's a possibility that, for example, we're going to continue to have serious problems from the pandemic in the next couple of years to make the medium-term economic situation a little less favorable than is now in the forecast. So it's very important to, when the General Assembly and the governor make decisions this year, that they not dramatically increase the trend rate of growth of expenditures to make it a higher slope than revenues. To some extent, we did that back in the adoption of Thornton. As Delegate Luedtke said, the current financing situation for Kerwin looks reasonably good, much better than it did just a year or so ago. When we adopted Thornton, at the same time, because of political pressures, the Governor Glendening went along with a scheduled reduction in income tax. And that's what set up a structural deficit during that period. And of course, we're paying for that now with the kind of deferred maintenance and under investment in agency capacity, because the state had to make budget reductions year after year after year to be able to come close to living up to its Thornton funding promises. I hope we don't do that again. That is, I hope we make sure that, given the importance of funding Kerwin, that we do not cut taxes so significantly that we put ourselves in the position again of having to make penny wise, pound foolish cuts in spending.
Eric, what are your thoughts about the out years and the risks?
I mean, I think Roy's description is spot on. I think the biggest danger right now is that, to borrow a phrase, that we engage in too much irrational exuberance and think that the good times are going to last forever. We're in a very good fiscal situation at the moment, but there are three certainties in life, right? Death, taxes, and recessions. There will be a recession again, and arguably that decision in the late 90s to cut the income tax rate, 20 years later is still impacting our fiscal situation and the choices we have to make now. When
I hear irrational exuberance from a Democratic majority leader, I begin to worry.
No, I mean, look, it's about, regardless of party in Maryland, one of the things that works really well in Maryland is that we make smart fiscal decisions. Democrats, Republicans, I think we're all in the same boat in understanding we're not the federal government, right? We can't spend massive deficits over the long term. So we have to be smart about how we do things. So we are, because of the surplus, we're going to have a little more flexibility than we normally do, but we have to be careful not to let it get out of control and set ourselves up in a few years for significant budget cuts or significant tax increases that will be disruptive to the state.
Can I add one thing, Sunil? And that is, the situation is actually even better than what is described by the Department of Legislative Services, because there's still a chunk of federal funds coming our way, both in terms of the flexible funding from the second year of the American Rescue Plan and then from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This last year, I think the legislature and the governor did a pretty good job at negotiating over how to use that first tranche of money from the American Rescue Plan. And it's important for them to do that again. The legislature certainly sent a signal in the Spending Affordability Committee about its desire to have a negotiation as well about the capital budget allocations. And so I hope that there'll be that kind of mature discussion between the legislature and the governor this year, even though it's an election year, as you implied. There's certainly some temptation to take a stance that's very close to the one party's base rather than others.
Let's talk about capital spending. Roy, maybe you can talk about what the committee recommended, and then we can go to the politics.
Well, the state has a capital debt affordability committee that's in effect dominated by the governor. And it makes a recommendation about how much money should be borrowed for general obligation bonds and then for bonds issued by the university system. And that's based on several ratios having to do with debt service as a percentage of the general fund, and then the outstanding debt as a proportion of personal income in the state. And so this year, because of the large cash surplus, the Capital Debt Affordability Committee recommended a substantially lower amount of general fund borrowing and making up at least a substantial portion of the unfunded requests for capital expenditures through so-called PAYGO financing, which is paying for the acquisition of capital assets with current revenues rather than borrowing and having to pay that money back over the next 15 years, as is commonly the case. Spending Affordability Committee said, okay, we're willing to do that, but we want to have some input over the specific capital budget projects that would be funded by PAYGO. And if the governor didn't go along with that, the legislature signaled it was willing to approve a higher level of capital spending. In addition, the Spending Affordability Committee talked about the obvious increase in construction costs and the need to adjust the longer-term plan for capital spending for the likely increase in costs for each project.
Okay. Eric?
So you're going to see over the next couple of years a significant amount of government-funded capital projects, construction going on in the state, right? I mean, part of this is, the ongoing capital budget. Part of it is potentially pay-go projects under this budget. Part of it is the federal infrastructure dollars. The back and forth between the governor and the legislature, I think, again, we in the past have ended up in a good place with the capital budget. I think we will again. But I think this is kind of a moment where, these projects that people have wanted, that have built up over time, that we haven't been able to afford to build, a lot more of them are going to get built over the next couple of years, particularly in transportation. But you're already seeing folks who are in other sectors who are arguing for more investment. So shifts to the school construction formulas to help the counties take advantage of the Built to Learn money that we passed a couple of years ago. The universities are looking at capital investments. The state parks, which have an $80 million or $100 million, depending on who you ask, deferred maintenance issue. So there's going to be a lot of capital investment here.
One thing I didn't hear, and maybe you meant it, meant transportation more broadly, is transit.
Yeah, well, transit is part of. I do mean transportation more broadly, right? So the transportation spending we're going to see will include transit. It'll include roads. It'll include investments in the port, for example. We've seen a lot of interest in ports given the supply chain issues in the economy right now. And one of the conversations in our port, in the Port of Baltimore, is going to be whether to add a third container berth for Panamax vessels coming into the port. There are ongoing investments going on at BWI. BWI just announced a new carrier is going to be opening next year, doing low-cost international flights to Europe, which BWI has not had as many international flights as Dulles and even national sometimes. And so, those will happen as well. But there's a shift going on within the transportation budget, even before all this new money, because there's been a recognition now at the State Department of Transportation that we've been underinvesting somewhat in pedestrian and bike infrastructure. So we heard at the road show, which is every year the Department of Transportation comes around and talks about their consolidated transportation plan. What we heard at the road show is that Secretary Slater has directed the department to find ways to sort of open up more money for sidewalks, for bike lanes. And that's gonna start addressing an incredible backlog we have across the state in those projects.
Roy?
Yeah, one other thing to keep in mind here is the incentives the state's going to face given the decisions made by the federal government and the allocation of the discretionary money in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, where Secretary Buttigieg and I assume Mitch Landrieu, the new coordinator of infrastructure spending in the White House, they have a fair amount of discretion and a lot of interest in putting money into climate change resilience expending. And that's an area that hasn't received as much discussion in the state as probably it deserves, because the state has a lot of risks along those lines, a very long shoreline, and some big problems, and where our capital budget historically has not put much weight on the climate change impacts on the capital budget. And I think we need to spend a little more time thinking about that.
Well, so my question then would be that whether or not the federal government supplies that money, we have money to put into environmental protection, and why are we not?
The big conversation over climate right now is building efficiency. That's been part of the driving. So what happened last session is Climate Solutions Now gets introduced. The conversations break down in disagreements over exactly, the details of the bill. Portions of it were pulled out and passed, like what became called the Tree Solutions Now Act, which is a tree planting program and goal. The building standards side, it didn't make it. And so that's under conversation right now, right? And that includes conversations both on the public sector side and the private sector side. The larger challenge on the public sector side is, the resiliency or mitigation is not the only goal that, for example, MCPS has to consider. And, so they're under pressure from parents to build out more classroom space, to reduce overcrowding, et cetera. They only have so much money right now, right? So they have to make some choices. And really, if we want to push that conversation, if We want those same buildings, if we want to continue to be able to reduce overcrowding and those issues while, implementing the gold standard for net zero buildings, we're going to need more money from the state and the county to make that happen.
But you have it now, right?
Well, the state's been willing to step up. The state's been willing to step up already before this, right? We've got some money now, but we also passed the Built to Learn Act, which was the largest single school construction investment in the state's history. But so far, the county has not stepped up. They haven't found a way to make that county match because the school construction is a state-county partnership. Now, the county would argue, in fairness, that they pay a larger share of county school construction in Montgomery County than the state does. And that's absolutely true, that they forward fund projects, and that's absolutely true. But, you can only point fingers so long, right? We've got $370 million sitting there in state money in the Built to Learn Act that the county hasn't taken advantage of yet, and they need to.
This is a good transition to a question I've been meaning to ask. So the state windfall also translates into a county windfall, right? Even property prices are growing and counties are going to have more money. What can the state do to make sure that this money then becomes available for the projects that we're looking at?
So you're not going to see those property tax revenues increase as quickly as other types of revenue, right? Sales tax revenue responds relatively quickly. During the pandemic, we saw people shifting from buying services to buying goods. That shows up in a lot more sales tax revenue, people buying stuff on Amazon. With property taxes, there's a couple factors. First of all, the reassessment of property values happens over a multi-year cycle. So you don't get all of that new value in property taxes all at once. Second, for residential property, we have limitations on how much your property taxes can increase over time for a homestead property, right? For your own property. So, over the long term, counties will see increases in revenue, and certainly, as income tax has done well, they're seeing that. To the extent that there are admissions and amusement taxes and people are going out again, they'll see small revenue increases from that because that's a relatively small portion of any county budget. But they're not going to see the same boost that we've seen at the state level just because of the type of taxes they rely on and how they're structured.
Okay. Roy?
No, I agree. That's accurate. I mean, one of the nice things about that lag in property tax revenues is that it helps smooth out revenues during a recession.
Correct.
So counties didn't suffer as much immediately, at least, from any recession.
Well, actually, that works out pretty well because if the tax increases are going to come in year 2 and year 3, by that time, probably this wave at the state level, the windfall at the state level will start to stabilize and property taxes can pick up. So in fact, if we plan now, we might get it right in 3 years.
Well, and here's the other factor. I mean, just like, Larry Hogan's answer to everything is tax cuts. Due respect to my colleagues at the county level, their mantra every year in good times and bad is that the state doesn't send enough money to the counties. So, we will inevitably have the counties coming to us and asking for more investment in things like highway user revenue, school construction, et cetera, et cetera.
At the same time, some of them are going to cut their tax rates, property tax rates.
Yes. Yeah.
Both of you are public policy professors. So let me ask you a question from sort of that angle. Are the politics of surplus fundamentally different from the politics of deficit, right? And I understand that you can buy more, but is the demands and the pushes and the pulls really different, or is it the same thing, just on the other side of the ledger?
We don't have much empirical evidence. There aren't too many periods when there are politics of surplus. And I think that provides the answer to your question as well, in that there are many good reasons why the politics of surplus don't last. Both because there are aberrations in terms of the economics of the situation, and then also the politics. Once you have a surplus, there's a very strong interest in reducing that surplus by cutting taxes or by increasing spending, or the combination of the both.
We don't have experience with surpluses that often. And when surpluses show up, they get spent relatively quickly. And, so we'll see. The real question, and the longer term question is, the structural budget surplus that we're projecting right now, is that real or is it missed, right? Will the economy shift again and will it disappear next year? If it's real, then that has significant implications for state policy generally. If it's not, then, it will have a one-time party spending a fair amount of money and then go back to the same old structural deficits.
I think he's onto a really important point. And go back to Kerwin as an example. In the Kerwin case, the state carried out its typical approach of dealing with a big problem and creating a blue ribbon task force and coming up with a strategic plan. And in this particular case, there was so much political support behind it and widespread recognition that we have a big problem that it seems likely that most of that strategic plan is actually going to be implemented. What we don't have in a lot of the rest of state government is something similar. That is extensive strategic planning and a thought about how we could substantially improve the nature of the state. Delegate Luedtke mentioned this commission he's on, led by former Governor Glendening, with 8 other state delegates and senators looking at the state parks. And Delegate Luedtke, I looked at the DNR response to some of the proposals that were made by members of the public to the commission, and the DNR response mentioned a strategic plan from 2016. I've searched high and low on the website for that strategic plan, and you can't find it. And it's hard to see in some of the rest of state governments a real emphasis on strategic planning and then using the managing for results data to come up with significant improvements. If we were to have a surplus, a significant structural surplus, then the state could do a little more strategic planning and a little more performance measurement. I think some of the, at least Democratic gubernatorial candidates are interested in using that approach. And that might provide an opportunity for us to have a more sustained response to some of the state's problems and generate some real opportunities for improvement.
Eric Luedtke, Roy Meyers, thank you for coming on I Hate Politics. And we'll be watching the new session in 2022. And I hope you'll come back.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So good to have you back again. And I have accepted. Well, I have accepted. Well, I have accepted.
What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Maryland House of Delegates Majority Leader Eric Luedtke and UMBC budget expert Roy Meyers? First, the politics of budget surplus are unique, but you can bet it's going to shape the 2022 governor's race. On the Democratic side, there will be a tendency to promise more spending. On the Republican side, we should expect a demand for tax cuts. And Governor Larry Hogan is probably going to use the next budget to tee it up for the Republican nominee. Second, in contrast to Democratic aspirants to the governor's office, the party in the General Assembly appears to be wanting prudence in the face of windfall, arguably preempting and blunting the demands for those tax cuts. This is extraordinary, really, given that the Democratic Party has been moving left in the state, and there is likely a coming push from counties and more progressive circles for more direct assistance, particularly for service workers who lost greatly during the pandemic, and for climate action, and certainly for school construction. Third, it is important to remember that Maryland isn't the only state that has an unexpected budget surplus. Other states, and certainly the counties too, are going to see windfall revenue. Property taxes go up and down less dramatically than income taxes, but with home values skyrocketing due to easy monetary policy, property tax collections will continue to grow even when income tax collections have stabilized. Incredibly, in the middle of a pandemic that should have devastated the economy. Government action saved the day. For all those who criticize government and the political process, keep this in mind. Government can do good and did so in a very short period of a very difficult time. Conversely, it is also time for political leaders to stop making excuses that there just isn't the money to fix our schools, our public health system, and bring about police reform. That's all for this episode. You've been listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. Music for this episode comes from DC area Southern Soul band King Soul. Tom Clifford and Jake Flack on vocals, Mark Noon on bass, Arif Durrani on keyboards, Ben Holmes on drums, Chris Watling on sax, Matt Ripito on tenor sax, and Vince McCall on trumpet. Don't miss them this New Year's Eve at Clyde's in Chevy Chase. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone who might want to, please email us at ihppod@gmail.com or reach out on Twitter at ihppod. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and your home. Happy New Year. See you next time.